They said the sound was small, almost polite, but the silence that followed swallowed the entire room. Stay with me, because what happened in the next few minutes would unravel a man's carefully built world and expose a truth no one at that table was ready to face. The chandelier light shimmered over crystal glasses and polished marble as Emily Carter sat perfectly still, one hand resting over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy, her breath measured, controlled, like she had practiced this moment 1,000 times before. Around her, the restaurant carried on in hushed elegance, waiters gliding, soft piano notes drifting, the quiet murmur of people who believed wealth could shield them from consequence. Across the table, Richard Hale adjusted his cufflinks, his expression tight, his patience thinner than the gold rim of his wine glass. To everyone watching, they looked like another powerful couple celebrating another perfect evening. But perfection has a sound when it cracks, and tonight, that crack echoed in a way no one could ignore. Emily didn't react the way people expected. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice. She simply blinked once, slowly, as if absorbing something deeper than embarrassment, something older, heavier. In that stillness, the entire room shifted. Conversations faltered. Eyes turned. Phones hovered just out of sight. Because even in a place built on discretion, people recognize the exact second when something crosses a line that can't be redrawn. Richard leaned back as if nothing unusual had happened, reaching for his glass, his voice calm, almost bored, continuing a sentence no one remembered. That was his power: control the narrative, and reality would follow. Or at least, it always had. Emily lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening slightly against the fabric of her dress, not in fear, but in calculation. Because this wasn't the first moment she had endured, it was just the first one witnessed. And witnesses change everything. Near the edge of the room, a waiter paused. He had been invisible all night, the way service staff are trained to be, present but unseen, silent but precise. But now, his stillness felt different. Intentional. His eyes didn't move to Richard. They stayed on Emily. And there was something in that look, recognition, maybe even restraint, that didn't belong in a room like this. He took a step forward, slow, deliberate, each movement cutting through the tension like a quiet signal no one else could yet interpret. Emily felt it before she saw it. That shift in the air. That subtle pull of something familiar brushing against the edges of memory. She lifted her head, just slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time. And in that instant, something unspoken passed between them, something that had nothing to do with the dinner, or the guests, or the man sitting across from her pretending the world was still under his control. Because some truths don't arrive loudly. They step in quietly, dressed as something ordinary, waiting for the exact moment to reveal what they really are. And tonight, in a room full of power, the most powerful person hadn't even taken a seat yet. The waiter did not rush, and that was the first detail that felt wrong to anyone paying attention, because in a place like this, hesitation could cost you your job, yet he moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing to lose and nothing to prove. His steps measured across the polished floor until he reached their table and stopped just within the soft halo of candlelight. Close enough to be seen clearly but far enough to remain formally invisible, exactly where someone in his position was supposed to stand, yet nothing about him felt ordinary anymore, not the way his shoulders squared slightly as he looked at Emily, not the way his voice, when it finally came, carried a calm that did not belong to service staff but to someone used to being heard. "Ma'am, would you like some water?" he asked, simple words, routine words, but the tone beneath them held something else, something steady and grounded, and Emily's breath caught for half a second before she answered. "Yes. Please." Her voice soft but controlled, because control was the only thing she had left to hold on to in a room that had just witnessed more than it was willing to acknowledge, and as he reached to pour, his hand paused for a fraction of a second, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Emily to see the faint scar along his wrist, a thin white line she had not seen in years but recognized instantly. A memory flickering behind her eyes like a photograph she had tried to forget, and suddenly the air felt heavier, thicker, as if time itself had slowed down to give that single detail room to breathe, Richard, oblivious or unwilling to notice, continued speaking, his voice cutting through the moment with rehearsed authority, talking about business, about expansion, about numbers that sounded impressive but hollow, because power spoken too often becomes noise, and no one at the table responded, not really. Their attention divided between the man performing control and the silence growing louder around him. The waiter set the glass down gently, the faint clink against the table echoing more than it should have, and then he said it, quietly, almost like a test. Emily. Just her name, nothing more, but it landed differently, not like a stranger reading from a receipt, but like someone who had said it 1,000 times before, someone who knew the weight behind it, and Emily's fingers tightened again, her pulse quickening, her mind racing through years she had buried under survival, because names carry history, and history does not disappear just because you stop talking about it. She looked up fully now, really looked, past the uniform, past the setting, into his eyes, and there it was, unmistakable, the same shade, the same intensity she had seen in childhood mirrors, the same quiet strength that had once stood between her and every storm she did not know how to face alone, and for a moment the world outside that table faded completely, replaced by a single, undeniable realization forming faster than she could process it, while across from her Richard finally noticed the shift, the way the room had gone too still, the way attention had moved away from him without his permission, and his expression hardened, irritation flickering into something sharper, because control was slipping, not dramatically, not yet, but enough for him to feel it, enough for him to react. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying that same polished edge that had worked in boardrooms and negotiations, but something about the moment made it sound smaller, thinner, like it no longer held the authority it once did, and the waiter turned his gaze slowly, deliberately, meeting Richard's eyes for the first time, not with defiance, not with anger, but with a calm that felt far more dangerous, because it suggested certainty, and certainty does not ask for permission, it simply arrives, and in that quiet exchange, something invisible shifted again. Something deeper than embarrassment or discomfort. Something that signaled the beginning of an unraveling no one in that room could stop. For a long second, no one spoke, and that silence carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, because it was the kind of silence that signals a shift no one can reverse, and Emily felt it settle into her chest as she studied the man standing beside her table, her mind moving faster than her expression allowed, piecing together fragments she had buried for years, the late nights, the unanswered calls. The day everything changed without explanation, and now here he was, not lost, not gone, just standing in front of her dressed as someone the world would overlook, and yet nothing about him could be overlooked anymore, especially not the way he held himself, especially not the way he said her name like it still belonged to him, like it had never been erased. Richard's patience snapped just enough to show through the cracks of his composure, as he set his glass down with deliberate precision. The sound sharper than necessary. "I asked you a question?" he repeated, his tone firm. Expecting the usual reaction, expecting the immediate correction, the apology, the submission that had always followed, but this time the rhythm broke, the waiter did not flinch, did not step back, did not lower his gaze the way protocol demanded, instead he answered calmly. "No problem, sir." And the word "sir" sounded different coming from him, not deferential, not submissive, just factual, like a label that no longer carried power, and that subtle difference was enough to make several people at nearby tables lean in slightly, their attention now fully captured, because something about this interaction no longer fit the script they were used to watching. Emily felt her heartbeat rise, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, recognition mixed with the fragile edge of hope, and it scared her more than anything else because hope changes decisions. And decisions change outcomes, and she had spent years surviving by not expecting anything at all. The waiter turned back to her, his voice softer now, but steadier. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, and it was such a simple question, so ordinary on the surface. But beneath it was something deeper, something protective, something that reached past the moment, and into a history only the two of them understood. Emily hesitated, her throat tightening slightly before she answered. "I am fine." The automatic response, the practiced response. But her eyes betrayed her, because they held the truths she could not say out loud, and he saw it, of course he saw it, because he had always been the one who noticed what others missed. Richard let out a short breath, a quiet scoff that carried irritation more than amusement. "We do not need a performance," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the table. "Just do your job." And there it was again, the assumption, the belief that roles defined reality, that titles determined worth, that a man in a tailored suit always outranked the one in uniform. But the waiter did not move, did not react the way he should have. Instead he held Richard's gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, long enough for the imbalance to become visible, long enough for the room to feel it, and then, with the slightest shift of his posture, he reached into his pocket, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise, and placed something small and unassuming on the table beside Emily's glass, a simple card, black, clean, with no visible logo from where most people sat. But Emily saw it clearly, saw the name before her mind could catch up, and in that instant, everything inside her went still. Because the past she thought she had lost was no longer a memory. It was sitting right in front of her, breathing, watching, waiting, and for the first time that night, she did not feel alone. Emily did not touch the card immediately, and that hesitation carried more meaning than any sudden reaction could have, because she understood instinctively that once she picked it up, once she allowed herself to confirm what her eyes were already telling her, there would be no returning to the version of reality she had been surviving in for years. And across from her Richard noticed the shift in her attention. The way her focus had moved away from him without permission, his jaw tightening slightly as his gaze dropped to the small object resting beside her glass. "What is that?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged with something sharper now, something closer to uncertainty than he would ever admit. Emily's fingers moved slowly, almost carefully, as if the air itself had grown heavier around that single point on the table, and when she finally lifted the card, the soft texture against her skin sent a quiet shock through her system, because it was real, undeniably real. Her eyes scanned the surface, taking in the clean typography, the understated design, and then the name, Daniel Carter, printed with a simplicity that carried its own kind of authority, followed by a title that made her breath catch, not because she did not understand it, but because she understood it too well, and in that moment the distance between memory and present collapsed completely. The brother she had lost was no longer a question, no longer a possibility. He was standing right beside her, watching, waiting, giving her the choice to recognize him or not. Richard leaned forward slightly, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the impatience underneath. "If this is some kind of distraction, I suggest you handle it quickly," he said, his voice lower now, quieter. But the edge remained, because control was slipping and he could feel it, even if he could not yet define why. Emily looked up, her eyes moving from the card to the man standing beside her, and for the first time that night, something in her expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough for anyone truly watching to notice that the silence around her was no longer empty. It was filled with something steadier, something grounded. "Daniel," she said softly, testing the name, letting it exist in the present instead of the past, and the slightest shift in his expression confirmed everything, not a smile, not relief, just a subtle acknowledgement, like a door opening without a sound, and in that quiet exchange, years of absence rewrote themselves in seconds. Richard let out a short laugh, dismissive, practiced. "You know him," he said, the question disguised as a statement, already forming a narrative that would place him back in control. But the waiter, Daniel, turned his attention to him fully now, and there was no hesitation in his posture, no trace of the invisibility he had carried moments before. "We are family," he said, the words simple, direct, leaving no space for interpretation, and that was the moment the room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could be felt in the stillness of every person within earshot, because family is a word that carries weight in any setting, but in a room built on hierarchy, it carries something more. It rewrites positions, it redraws lines, it introduces a variable no one had accounted for. Richard's expression stilled completely, the calculation behind his eyes accelerating, trying to catch up, trying to regain footing. But something in the way Daniel stood, in the calm certainty of his voice, made it clear that this was not a coincidence, not a misunderstanding, not something that could be dismissed or corrected with a simple command, and Emily felt it then, not just the presence of her brother, but the shift in balance, subtle but undeniable, like the first movement of a structure beginning to give way, and for the first time since she had walked into that room, the weight she had been carrying did not feel quite as heavy, because she was no longer the only one holding it. Richard did not respond immediately, and that pause was the first real sign that something inside his carefully constructed control had begun to fracture, because men like him relied on instant reactions, on dominance that never hesitated, and now hesitation had entered the room like an uninvited guest, subtle but impossible to ignore. His eyes moved between Emily and Daniel, recalculating, reassessing, searching for a weakness he could still exploit, but what he found instead was something unfamiliar, a connection he could not interrupt, a history he did not own, and that realization tightened his expression in a way that made the air around the table feel even colder. "Family," he repeated, the word slower this time, as if testing its weight, trying to reshape it into something smaller, something manageable, but it refused to shrink, because truth has a way of expanding in the exact moments someone tries to contain it. Emily held the card a second longer before placing it gently back on the table, her movements calm, deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain, and that calmness did more to shift the balance than any confrontation could have, because it signaled something new, something Richard had never had to deal with before, a version of her that was not reacting to him, not adjusting to him, but simply existing beside him without permission, and that difference unsettled him more than he wanted to show. Daniel remained exactly where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, but his presence alone had already changed the dynamic of the entire room. Nearby tables had gone quiet in that careful way people do when they know they are witnessing something they will talk about later, something that will not stay contained within the walls of a single evening. And the soft piano music that had once filled the space now felt distant, almost irrelevant, like background noise in a moment that demanded attention. "I think this conversation is over," Richard said finally, his voice controlled again, but thinner now, lacking the weight it carried before, as he reached for his jacket, signaling an end on his terms, or at least attempting to, because ending a moment had always been his strongest move. Walk away, close the door, decide what mattered and what did not. But as he stood, Daniel spoke again, not louder, not forceful, just clear enough to cut through the motion. "Actually, it is just beginning." And that single sentence landed with quiet precision, stopping Richard mid-movement, not physically, but mentally, because it introduced something he had not accounted for, continuation without his control, and Emily felt it too, the shift from reaction to unfolding, from surviving a moment to witnessing what came next, her hand resting over her stomach again, not out of habit this time, but with intention, grounding herself in something real, something that extended beyond the room, beyond Richard, beyond everything that had defined her life up to this point, and for the first time, the future did not feel like a repetition of the past. It felt open, uncertain, but not empty. Richard turned back slightly, his expression composed but sharper now. "I do not know what game you think you are playing," he said, directing his words at Daniel, but it was clear he was speaking to both of them, trying to reassert a narrative where he still understood the rules. "But I suggest you remember where you are." And for a moment, the room held its breath again, waiting to see if the old dynamic would reestablish itself, waiting to see if the invisible lines would fall back into place. But Daniel did not respond with argument, did not raise his voice, did not match the tone. Instead he simply reached into his jacket, retrieving a small device, his phone, and with a calm that bordered on effortless, he tapped the screen once before placing it on the table beside the card, the display lighting up just enough for Emily to see a single incoming notification, a name she did not recognize, followed by a message that read, "Everything is ready." And in that moment, without any announcement, without any visible escalation, it became clear that this was not a coincidence, not an interruption, but a sequence, something set in motion long before this dinner ever began. And as Emily looked from the message to Daniel, she realized that whatever came next was not going to ask for permission either. The message on the screen did not make a sound, but it carried a presence that spread across the table like a quiet signal, and Emily felt her pulse steady instead of race, because whatever was happening was no longer chaotic, it was controlled, just not by the person who had always controlled everything before. Richard's eyes flicked down to the phone, then back to Daniel, his expression sharpening with a kind of focus he reserved for negotiations, for moments when something valuable was at stake, and this time, whether he admitted it or not, that something was his position. "You are stepping out of line," he said, his voice measured, careful now, as if choosing each word with precision could restore the balance he felt slipping, but Daniel did not respond immediately. He let the silence sit, let it stretch just long enough to make the room lean in again. Because silence, when used correctly, can carry more authority than any statement, and when he finally spoke, his tone remained even, almost calm enough to be mistaken for indifference. "No, I am correcting one," he said, and the distinction landed clearly, not aggressive, not defensive, just factual, as if the situation itself had already been decided and he was simply acknowledging it. Emily watched the exchange with a growing clarity she had not felt in years, her thoughts no longer scattered, no longer trapped in reaction, but aligning into something steady, something deliberate, because for the first time, the dynamic in front of her was not one-sided. It was shifting, evolving, revealing layers she had never been allowed to see before, and that realization changed the way she sat, the way she breathed, even the way she looked at the man across from her. Richard let out a controlled breath, a subtle reset, his posture straightening as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his own phone with practiced confidence, because control, to him, was always just one call away, one command, one instruction that would remind everyone in the room exactly who he was. He tapped the screen quickly, bringing it to his ear, his gaze never leaving Daniel's, waiting for the familiar reassurance of connection, of response, of immediate action, but instead, nothing happened, no answer, no confirmation, just a delay that stretched a second too long, and in environments like this, a second can feel like a shift in gravity. His jaw tightened slightly as he lowered the phone, checking the screen again, and Emily saw it, the smallest flicker of confusion crossing his face, gone almost instantly. But not before it registered, not before it confirmed what she was beginning to understand, that whatever Daniel had set in motion was already moving beyond reach. "Is something wrong?" Daniel asked quietly, not as a challenge, not as mockery, but as a simple observation, and that made it land even harder, because it forced Richard to acknowledge a moment he could not immediately fix. The room held its breath again, but this time the tension felt different, less like anticipation and more like realization, like watching a pattern break in real time. Richard lowered his phone slowly, placing it on the table with controlled precision, as if the gesture itself could restore order. "This does not change anything," he said, his voice firm, reclaiming its edge, but the certainty was thinner now, less convincing, because statements repeated too quickly often revealed doubt rather than confidence. Daniel glanced briefly at Emily before returning his attention to Richard, and there was something in that glance, something protective, something grounding, that anchored the moment in a way no argument could undo. "It already has," he replied, and he did not raise his voice, did not need to, because truth does not require volume to be heard, and Emily felt it settle into her chest, not as fear, not as uncertainty, but as something quieter, stronger, a recognition that the night was no longer unfolding around her, it was unfolding for her, and that difference changed everything. The shift did not announce itself with raised voices or sudden movement. It settled quietly into the room like a truth people could feel but were not yet ready to name, and Emily noticed how everything around her seemed sharper now, clearer, as if the fog she had been living inside had finally lifted just enough for her to see the structure of things, the way power moved, the way control was maintained, and more importantly, the way it could be taken away. Richard remained standing, his posture rigid with the effort of holding on to authority that was no longer responding the way it used to, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Daniel, not with dismissal anymore, but with calculation, because now there was something to measure, something to understand. "You are making a mistake," he said, his voice lower, more controlled, as if shifting tone could regain influence. But Daniel did not react to the warning, did not argue, did not engage in the way Richard expected. Instead he reached for the glass of water. He had just poured and adjusted it slightly closer to Emily, a small, almost insignificant gesture, but in that moment it carried more weight than anything Richard had said because it showed priority, it showed intention, it showed that the center of this moment had already changed. Emily followed the movement with her eyes, her hand resting lightly against the table now, no longer clenched, no longer bracing. And that subtle relaxation did not go unnoticed, because people who have relied on control their entire lives can sense the exact second it stops working, even if they do not understand why. A quiet murmur moved through the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but present enough to confirm that this was no longer private, that whatever was happening here had already begun to extend beyond the table, into conversations, into perception, into consequence. Richard exhaled slowly, a controlled release, as if recalibrating, and then he straightened his jacket, the motion precise, deliberate, a physical attempt to restore the version of himself that had always dominated spaces like this. "I do not entertain theatrics," he said, directing the statement at both of them, but his gaze lingered on Daniel, searching for a reaction, a misstep, anything that would return the advantage, but Daniel simply met his eyes, steady, unshaken, and for the first time, there was something visible in that calm, not just certainty, but authority, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it is already understood. "Then you should not have created one," Daniel replied, and the words were not sharp, not aggressive, but they landed with a quiet finality that shifted the atmosphere again, because they reframed the entire moment, not as an interruption, not as an escalation, but as a response, and responses imply cause, imply responsibility, imply that something began long before this conversation ever reached this point. Emily felt the weight of that realization settle into her, not heavy, not suffocating, but grounding, like stepping onto solid ground after years of uncertainty. And for the first time, she allowed herself to look directly at Richard without the instinct to adjust, to soften, to accommodate, her expression calm, composed, but no longer distant, no longer absent. And that difference was unmistakable, because presence changes everything. Richard saw it. Of course he saw it, and something in his expression flickered, not anger, not yet, but something closer to disbelief, because the version of Emily he had built his control around no longer existed in front of him, and that realization carried implications he could not immediately fix, could not immediately rewrite. The phone on the table remained silent, the message still glowing faintly on the screen. A reminder that whatever had been set in motion was continuing beyond this conversation, beyond this room, and Emily realized then that this moment was not about confrontation, it was about exposure, about the quiet unraveling of something that had always relied on staying hidden, and as she sat there, no longer shrinking, no longer reacting, she understood something she had not allowed herself to believe before, that power does not always disappear loudly, sometimes it simply stops being recognized. And when that happens, there is nothing left to hold it in place. The room did not return to normal, not after that shift, because once a pattern breaks it does not quietly repair itself, it exposes everything that was holding it together, and Emily could feel that exposure now in the way people were no longer pretending not to notice, in the way conversations had faded into a low, cautious silence, in the way even the staff moved differently, slower, more aware. As if the entire space understood that something larger than a private disagreement was unfolding. Richard remained standing, but the confidence that once filled that posture had thinned into something more rigid, more deliberate, like a performance that required effort to maintain. His gaze moved briefly around the room, taking inventory, assessing who was watching, who might matter, who might remember, because reputation had always been his strongest currency, and tonight it was no longer fully under his control. He reached again for his phone, not to call this time, but to check, to confirm, to reassure himself that the systems he relied on were still intact, but the screen offered no comfort, only the same absence of response, the same delay that now felt less like coincidence and more like design. Emily noticed the movement, noticed the subtle tension in his hand, and for the first time she understood it clearly, not as strength, but as dependence. Because power that requires constant confirmation is not as stable as it appears, Daniel shifted his weight. Slightly, just enough to break the stillness, and as he did, another staff member approached quietly from behind, not hurried, not uncertain, but with the same calm precision that defined every movement Daniel had made. The man stopped beside him and spoke in a low voice, respectful but direct. "Everything is in place, sir." And that single word changed everything again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that echoed through the room with unmistakable clarity, because titles matter. Especially when they are revealed instead of announced, and Emily saw it register across the room in subtle ways, a pause in movement, a shift in posture, a recalibration of attention. Richard's expression stilled completely for a fraction of a second, the kind of stillness that comes when a new variable enters too quickly to process. And when he spoke again, his voice was controlled, but the edge had changed, less certain, more cautious. "Sir?" he repeated, as if testing the word, as if trying to place it within his understanding of the situation, but Daniel did not elaborate, did not correct, did not explain. He simply acknowledged the staff member with a slight nod before turning his attention back to the table, back to Emily, back to the center of the moment, and that lack of explanation spoke louder than any declaration could have. Because it confirmed that the reality of the situation did not need to be argued, it simply existed. Emily felt the realization settle fully into place now, not as a shock, not as disbelief, but as clarity, the kind that removes doubt rather than creates it. Her brother had not just returned, he had returned with presence, with structure, with a level of control that did not need to be displayed to be effective, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe without measuring it, without controlling it, without preparing for what might come next, because what was coming was no longer unpredictable, it was unfolding with intention. Richard lowered his phone slowly, placing it back on the table with a precision that felt more like restraint than confidence, his eyes fixed on Daniel now, no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but focused, calculating. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, and it was not a challenge, not this time, it was a question, real and unguarded, because the answer mattered in a way nothing else in this moment did. And Daniel met his gaze without hesitation, without performance, his voice calm, steady, carrying no need for emphasis. "The owner," he said, and the words settled into the room like a final piece falling into place, not loud, not forceful, but absolute, and in that instant, the structure of the night rearranged itself completely, not through confrontation, not through escalation, but through recognition, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And Emily realized that everything that had felt immovable before was already shifting, already changing, not because someone demanded it, but because the truth no longer allowed it to stay the same. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore, and for a moment, even the soft background music seemed to fade completely, as if the space itself needed to acknowledge what had just been revealed. Emily felt it in the way the air shifted around her, lighter somehow, clearer, like stepping out of a shadow she had been standing in for far too long, while across from her Richard did not move immediately, his expression frozen between calculation and disbelief. Because the equation he had relied on no longer balanced, and men like him were not trained to respond to uncertainty, they were trained to eliminate it, but this was not something he could dismiss or override, not with a command, not with a call. Not with the quiet confidence that had carried him through every other situation. His gaze moved again, slower this time, taking in the staff who now stood differently, the subtle alignment of attention that no longer pointed toward him. And that realization did not come all at once, it unfolded piece by piece, each detail confirming the same truth, that control had already shifted before he realized it was happening. "If that is supposed to mean something," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter, more contained, as if he were choosing restraint over reaction. "Then explain it." And it was not a demand, not entirely, it was something closer to a request dressed as authority. Because understanding had become more important than dominance in that moment, Daniel did not rush to answer, he did not fill the silence unnecessarily, instead he allowed it to stretch, allowed the room to sit with the weight of what had already been said, because explanations are less powerful when the truth is already visible. Emily watched him, really watched him now, not as a stranger, not as a memory, but as someone present, someone real, and the years between them seemed to collapse in the space of a few seconds, not erased, but redefined, because absence does not erase connection, it only delays it, and when it returns, it carries everything that was left unsaid. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. "It means that tonight is not yours to control," he said. And there was no challenge in it, no aggression, just clarity, the kind that does not need to convince anyone because it is already true. Richard let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite, a reflex more than a reaction, because disbelief often looks like dismissal before it fully registers. "You think you can walk into this and change how things work?" he said, his tone sharper now, reaching for something familiar, something that had worked before, but even as he spoke, the words felt less grounded, less certain, because the environment around him was no longer reinforcing them. Daniel did not respond to the tone, he responded to the moment, reaching once more for his phone and turning the screen slightly, just enough for Emily to see, not enough to display it openly, but enough to confirm what she was already beginning to understand. A series of notifications, silent but persistent, each one marking a step, a process, something unfolding beyond the room, beyond the table, beyond anything Richard could directly influence in real time. Emily's breath slowed as she took it in, not the details, not the specifics, but the pattern, the intention behind it, and for the first time, she realized that this night had not been spontaneous. It had been prepared, structured, designed to reach this exact moment. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, catching the movement, sensing the shift, even if he could not fully see it. "What are you doing?" he asked, and now the question carried weight, real weight, because it came from a place that no longer assumed control, and Daniel met his gaze once more, steady, unhurried. "I am making sure everything reflects what already is," he replied, and that answer did not explain, it revealed, because it suggested that the change was not being created, it was being uncovered. Brought into alignment with something that had existed long before this dinner began, Emily felt it settle into her completely now, not as fear, not as hesitation, but as certainty, quiet and undeniable, and as she sat there, no longer shrinking into the edges of the moment, she understood something that changed everything, that sometimes justice does not arrive with noise or force, sometimes it arrives with clarity. And once it does, nothing remains the same. The clarity did not rush forward, it expanded, steady and undeniable, filling every corner of the moment until there was no space left for denial to hide, and Emily felt it settle into her bones like something she had always known but never allowed herself to fully accept, while across from her Richard's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but in the small, telling ways that reveal more than any outburst ever could. The slight tightening around his eyes, the measured inhale that came just a fraction too late, the way his fingers rested against the table without quite relaxing, because control had not disappeared completely. But it was no longer absolute, and that difference was everything. "You are overestimating your position," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier firmness, reaching for structure, for logic, for anything that could restore a familiar hierarchy. But the room did not respond the way it used to, the quiet attention remained fixed. Not on him, but on the unfolding exchange, and that alone weakened the effect of his words. Daniel did not interrupt, did not counter immediately, instead he allowed the statement to exist on its own, unsupported, unreinforced, and in that absence, it began to lose its weight. Emily noticed how natural that felt, how different from the past where every word Richard spoke had demanded a reaction. Demanded agreement or defense, and now there was space, actual space to observe, to choose, to not respond at all. Daniel finally spoke, his tone unchanged, steady, deliberate. "No, I am recognizing it," he said, and the distinction was subtle but decisive, because recognition implies something already true, something that does not depend on approval or permission. Richard's gaze sharpened, focusing fully now, abandoning the broader performance for something more direct, more personal. "And what exactly do you think you are recognizing?" he asked, and this time the question carried intent. real intent, because the answer mattered in a way he could not ignore. Daniel shifted his attention briefly to Emily again, not for confirmation, not for validation, but as a quiet acknowledgement, a grounding point in the middle of everything else, and then he answered, "That she does not belong in a situation that requires her to diminish herself." And the words were not dramatic, not loud, but they landed with a precision that cut through every layer of the evening, because they reframed everything that had happened, not as a moment, but as a pattern, not as an exception, but as a system. Emily felt something inside her release at that, not visibly, not in a way that anyone else could immediately see, but internally, deeply, like a tension she had carried for years finally loosening its hold. Richard's expression hardened again, but this time the reaction felt more contained, more calculated. As if he were choosing carefully how much to reveal. "You are making assumptions about something you do not understand," he said, and the statement carried an edge of defensiveness now, subtle but present, because explanation is often the first step away from certainty. Daniel did not push, did not escalate, instead he reached for the phone once more and tapped the screen lightly, and within seconds, another subtle shift moved through the room, the kind that is felt before it is seen, a change in attention among the staff, a quiet coordination that did not require visible instruction, and then, from the far end of the dining room, the manager approached, his posture respectful but purposeful, stopping just beside the table. "Sir," he said, directing the word toward Daniel without hesitation, "we have completed the review you requested." And that phrase, simple as it was, carried layers beneath it, layers that suggested process, preparation, intention. Richard's eyes moved quickly to the manager, then back to Daniel, the calculation returning, faster now, sharper, because pieces were falling into place whether he acknowledged them or not. "What review?" he asked, and now there was no disguise in the question, no attempt to frame it differently, just a direct need for information, because understanding had become urgent. Daniel met his gaze, calm as ever. "The one that ensures this environment reflects its standards," he replied, and again, the words did not accuse, did not attack, they simply revealed. And Emily understood then that this was not about a single moment, not about a single action, it was about alignment, about bringing everything into the light where it could no longer operate unchecked. And as she sat there, her hand resting steady over her stomach, her posture no longer guarded, she realized that the night was no longer about enduring. It was about witnessing something unfold that had been set in motion long before she ever walked into that room, and for the first time, she was not just part of the story, she was at the center of its turning point. The manager's presence did not dominate the scene, but it anchored it, giving structure to something that had already begun unfolding, and Emily noticed how his posture remained steady, respectful toward Daniel, yet firm in his role. As if he understood that this moment required precision more than force. Richard's gaze shifted between them, his expression now carefully composed, but the tension beneath it unmistakable. Because each new detail added weight to a reality he could no longer ignore. "I was not informed of any review," he said, his tone measured, controlled, reaching again for authority through expectation, but the words landed differently now, not as a command, but as a statement that no longer carried automatic compliance. The manager did not react defensively, did not hesitate, he simply responded with quiet clarity. "The review was initiated internally, sir, in accordance with ownership standards." And that phrase, simple as it was, reinforced the structure that had already been revealed, a structure that did not include Richard at its center, and Emily saw it register again, that subtle shift in his expression, the recalculation, the awareness that information was moving without him, decisions being made without his input. Daniel remained still, not intervening, not directing, allowing the process to speak for itself, because control that is real does not need to be constantly demonstrated, it exists whether it is acknowledged or not. Emily felt a quiet steadiness grow within her, not something sudden or overwhelming, but something gradual, like a foundation settling into place after years of instability. Her thoughts no longer scattered, no longer reactive, but aligned with the moment in front of her. Richard exhaled slowly. A controlled release that carried more effort than ease. "And what exactly does this review concern?" he asked. And now the question held focus, intention, because he understood that answers mattered more than appearances at this point. The manager glanced briefly at Daniel, receiving a subtle nod before continuing. Guest experience and conduct within the establishment, he replied, and again, the words did not accuse directly, but they carried implication, and implication, when supported by context, can be more powerful than direct confrontation. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest visible reaction, but enough to signal that the meaning had landed, that the conversation was no longer abstract, no longer theoretical. Emily watched him, not with fear, not with anticipation, but with a clarity she had never allowed herself before, because for the first time, she was not interpreting his reactions as something she needed to adjust to, she was simply observing them. Daniel shifted his attention to her once more, his expression calm, steady, offering nothing performative, just presence. And in that presence was something she recognized instantly, something she had not felt in years, protection without control, support without expectation, and it grounded her in a way that changed everything about how she experienced the moment. The manager continued, his tone consistent, professional. Based on our standards, certain behaviors require immediate evaluation. And the phrasing remained careful, measured, but the direction was clear, the process was moving forward, not paused, not waiting for permission. Richard let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite frustration, something in between, as if acknowledging a shift he could no longer deny. You are implying something, he said, and this time there was no attempt to disguise the statement, no attempt to soften it, just a direct recognition of what was happening. Daniel met his gaze without hesitation. No, he said, his voice steady. It is being clarified. And that distinction settled into the space with quiet certainty, because clarification removes ambiguity, it removes the space where denial can exist. Emily felt the final piece fall into place then, not dramatically, not with any visible reaction, but internally, completely, because she understood now that this moment was not about confrontation, it was about alignment, about bringing everything into a state where it reflected truth rather than perception, and as she sat there, no longer shrinking, no longer adjusting, she realized that what was unfolding was not just a shift in the room. It was a shift in her, a movement from endurance to presence, from silence to recognition, and once that shift happens, there is no returning to what came before. The word clarified did not linger as a threat, it settled as a conclusion, and Emily felt the difference immediately, because conclusions do not demand reaction, they simply mark the point where something can no longer continue the way it once did. The manager remained composed, his posture unchanged, but there was a quiet finality in the way he stood, as if the process had already reached its next stage. And all that remained was to acknowledge it. Richard's gaze shifted once more, slower now. Less reactive, more deliberate, as if he understood that whatever response he chose next would not restore what had already shifted. And what happens after this clarification? He asked, his voice steady. But the question carried a new weight, because it came from a place that no longer assumed control. Daniel did not answer immediately, he allowed the moment to breathe, allowed the reality to settle fully into the space, and when he finally spoke, his tone remained calm, almost neutral. That depends on whether the environment can maintain its standards moving forward, he said, and the phrasing was careful, not accusatory, not confrontational, but it carried implication, clear and undeniable, because standards, once defined, require alignment. Emily felt that word resonate more than anything else that had been said. Standards, not expectations, not demands, but something measurable. Something consistent, something that did not change depending on who was speaking or who was listening, and for the first time, she realized how much of her life had existed outside of that kind of structure, how often she had adjusted instead of being acknowledged. Richard remained still for a moment, his expression no longer attempting to dismiss or dominate, but processing, calculating. Because the framework of the situation had shifted beyond his immediate influence. You are suggesting that I do not meet those standards, he said, and this time there was no disguise in the statement, no attempt to soften it, just a direct recognition of what was being implied. Daniel met his gaze evenly. I am saying that the environment does not adjust to individuals, he replied, and the distinction was precise, because it removed the focus from accusation and placed it on principle. Emily felt a quiet strength rise within her at that, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, because principles do not shift under pressure, they remain consistent, and consistency creates stability, something she had not felt in a long time. The manager stepped slightly forward, not interrupting, but reinforcing the structure already in place. "We are prepared to ensure that all guests experience the same standard," he added, his tone professional, measured, and that statement carried its own quiet authority, because it confirmed that this was not a personal moment, it was a procedural one. Something that extended beyond individuals, beyond relationships, beyond anything that could be negotiated in a single conversation. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing just slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because there are moments when even the most controlled environments reveal a boundary that cannot be crossed without consequence, and this was one of them. His gaze moved briefly to Emily, not with the same certainty it once held, but with something more measured, more aware, as if seeing her differently for the first time, not as part of a system he controlled, but as someone existing independently of it. Emily held that gaze for a moment, not with challenge, not with hesitation, but with clarity, because she no longer needed to adjust to it, she simply allowed it to exist, and in that quiet exchange, something fundamental shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not reverse itself once the night ended. Daniel remained beside her, not intervening, not directing, just present, and that presence carried more meaning than any action could have, because it represented something constant, something that did not require performance or validation, something that existed regardless of circumstance. And as Emily sat there, her hand resting steady, her breath even, her posture grounded, she realized that what had begun as a moment of imbalance had become something else entirely, something structured, something defined, something that no longer depended on silence to survive. And once something is defined clearly, it no longer returns to what it was before. Nothing in the room needed to be said anymore, because everything that mattered had already been placed where it belonged, and Emily felt that realization settle over her like a quiet certainty, not loud, not overwhelming, but complete, the kind of clarity that does not ask questions because it no longer needs answers. Richard stood still for a moment longer, not defeated, not broken, but changed in a way that could not be reversed, because the framework he had relied on was no longer supporting him, and once that structure shifts, no amount of control can restore it to what it was. His gaze moved one last time across the table, lingering on Emily, but the look was different now, not possessive, not dismissive, just aware, as if recognizing something he had never accounted for, something that had existed outside of his influence all along, and without another word, he reached for his jacket. The motion slower than before, more deliberate, not an exit of authority, but an acknowledgement of boundary, and when he turned to leave, the room did not react the way it might have once done. There was no immediate adjustment, no automatic deference, just quiet observation, because perception had already shifted, and once people see something clearly, they do not return to what they believed before. The manager stepped slightly aside, maintaining professionalism without interference, allowing the moment to complete itself without disruption, and as Richard walked toward the exit, the distance between him and the table felt larger than the few steps it required because it was not measured in feet, it was measured in control, in perception, in something that had quietly dissolved without spectacle. Emily watched him go, not with relief, not with anger, but with a calm that surprised even her, because she was not measuring his departure as a loss or a victory, she was simply recognizing it as the end of something that no longer held weight, and that recognition brought a stillness she had not felt in years. Daniel remained beside her, not stepping forward, not filling the space, just present, and that presence was enough, because it did not demand anything, it did not direct anything, it simply existed. Steady and unchanging, and Emily turned slightly toward him, her expression soft but grounded. "You came back," she said quietly, the words simple, but carrying everything that had been left unsaid for years, and he met her gaze with that same calm certainty. "I never left when it mattered," he replied, and there was no need for further explanation, because some connections do not depend on time, they depend on truth, and truth does not disappear.